The oxygen mask was off. The room was silent, save for the dull, rhythmic beep of the monitor beside his head. Lucas was gone. But his absence didn't create a void. It created a wall, a sudden, blinding barrier between the past I thought I had and the present truth. I stood there, rigid, listening to the quiet sobs of the woman who was not his wife. Clara Durant. Her face, tear-streaked and fragile, was nestled against the lifeless hand of the man I had slept beside for 30 years. 30 years of my life. I looked at my son, Vincent. He was still standing there, his posture impeccably straight, his expression an unsettling blend of grief and calculated loyalty. He wasn't looking at his father. He was looking at Clara. He was guarding her. "Aunt Clara," the words echoed in my head, cold and sharp. I walked slowly away from the bed. Every step was a deliberate protest against the cold floor and the heavier truth I carried. I needed air. I needed to move away from the ghost and his angel. "Mother, where are you going?" Vincent's voice was the sound of a closing vault. I stopped at the doorway, my hand on the cool metal of the handle. I didn't turn around. "I'm going home, Vincent. The place where I kept your father's memory safe." I heard Clara's small, wounded sound behind me. Lucas's angel. "We need to discuss the funeral arrangements," Vincent pressed, his voice betraying a hint of impatience. "You handle it, Vincent," I said, finally turning, giving him a flat, weary look. "You seem to know your father's deepest wishes better than I do." I left. I left the sterile room, the scent of death and roses, and the terrible intimacy of their shared grief. I left them to their truth. The drive from the hospital on the north side back to our house in Lincoln Park was a blur. The Chicago skyline, usually a proud fortress of steel and glass, seemed suddenly brittle, built on a foundation of sand and lies. When I entered the house, the silence was deafening. It wasn't the familiar silence of our life, the one I had mistaken for peaceful stability. This was the silence of an abandoned stage, the applause having long died out. The house was our testament to stability. The heavy oak doors, the leather-bound books, the expensive quiet art on the walls. Everything was solid, respectable, and cold. I realized now that the house had never been a home. It had been a monument to the perfect, respectable marriage we had pretended to have. I went straight to Lucas's study, his sanctuary, the place he retreated to every evening, closing the door on the world and on me. I sat in his chair. The leather was still warm. I ran my hand over the dark wood of his desk, searching for some residue of the man I loved. But I found only the ghost. I remembered how I had built my life around his silence. When he was quiet at dinner, I thought he was contemplating the complexity of his business deals. When he gave me a brief kiss before leaving for work, I thought it was the reserved affection of an intellectual. His lack of demonstrative love, the gentle touches, the small, spontaneous words, I had internalized as a sign of his deep character, his fear of cheapening genuine emotion. I had created a perfect narrative for my stable marriage, and Clara had been the proof of my foolishness. She was the emotion he was afraid to cheapen. She was the spontaneous touch. She was the depth. I closed my eyes. It wasn't anger that filled me. It was a profound, aching stupidity. How could I, a woman of 65, have been so blind? My son knew. Vincent knew. He had called her Aunt Clara. He had promised to take care of her. That was the key. Vincent. Lucas's betrayal wasn't just a simple affair. It was a secondary, parallel life, fully acknowledged and integrated into the family's future. Vincent's coolness, his rigid logic, his emotional distance, they weren't inherent traits. They were lessons learned from his father, lessons on how to manage feeling, how to compartmentalize love, how to maintain a respectable facade while keeping the true heart locked away. Lucas had not just betrayed me, he had taught our son how to betray. He had passed on the infection of emotional duplicity. That was the true inheritance. I stood up and went to the large built-in safe hidden behind a bookshelf. I opened it with the combination I had known for 30 years. It held deeds, bonds, and our wills. I didn't look at the money. I looked for the documents that would clarify Clara's position. It was there, tucked neatly into a folder labeled Private, a small handwritten note from Lucas, dated 10 years ago. My darling Clara, if anything happens, Vincent knows. He will take care of everything. You will never be alone. Ever, L. It was a contract of the heart, witnessed and accepted by my son. I felt a tremor run through me. Not a tremor of shock, but of clarity. The stable life had been a mirage, but the reality was a chance for a new kind of stability, a stability born from the wreckage of the old. I could not stop Lucas from having betrayed me, but I could stop that wound from replicating in the next generation. I had to show Vincent that an honest life, however painful, was superior to a respectable lie. I put the note back. The fight was not over the money or the house. It was over the soul of my son. And the ghost of Lucas Moreland was not going to win. The revelation of Lucas's note, my darling Clara, Vincent knows, he will take care of everything, had stripped away the last layer of my 30-year delusion. The stability I had clung to was just a carefully constructed museum piece, dusted daily, but utterly lifeless inside. I spent the next 3 days in the silence of the house, refusing all calls from Vincent. I needed the time to catalog the fragments of my memory, to find the subtle cracks that I had, for decades, deliberately plastered over. I needed to see the ghost's face clearly before I could truly mourn the man I thought he was. The signs had always been there, small, insistent whispers I had dismissed as the normal erosion of long-term marriage. Lucas had been a creature of routine, and routine was our cage. Every Tuesday he played golf. Every Thursday he attended a business dinner. Every Sunday we had a quiet, televised football game in the library. But in the last 5 years the routine had tightened, becoming brittle. He would leave the house earlier, citing urgent calls with London or Hong Kong. He would return late, his answers about his day brief, clipped, and always the same. Nothing of interest, Eleanor. Just business. I remembered a small party we hosted, perhaps 5 years ago. It was our 30th wedding anniversary. Lucas had insisted on a small, quiet gathering. No fuss, no extravagance. He said he detested public displays. I had believed him. Now I saw it differently. He detested the hypocrisy of a public display. During the toast, Vincent, already a successful corporate lawyer, had raised his glass. His words, which I had then taken as respectful formality, now sounded chillingly detached. To the bedrock of stability. To Mom and Dad, who showed me that structure and logic are the true keys to a long partnership. Lucas had only smiled a thin, closed smile. He hadn't met my eyes. He had looked past me toward the doorway, as if waiting for someone else to enter, for the real celebration to begin. I recalled the infrequent gifts. Never jewelry, never flowers. Always something functional for the house, a new piece of art, a vintage bottle of wine, a subscription to a respected journal. Gifts that served the facade, the image of the intellectual couple. He never gave me a gift that spoke solely to me, to the woman beneath the wife. He never tried to guess my desires. He only fulfilled his duty to the institution. The most telling sign, the one that now felt like a physical blow, was the growing distance in his eyes. When we did speak, truly speak, about something personal, like Vincent's distant manner, or my desire to travel more, Lucas's gaze would drift. His eyes, usually sharp and penetrating, would become vague, unfocused, as if he were looking through me to a warmer, more vivid landscape. He wasn't seeing Eleanor Moreland, the woman he married. He was seeing the empty space where Clara Durant should have been. Vincent, our son, had absorbed this detachment. He was Lucas's perfect copy. He spoke the language of success, of metrics and outcomes, but rarely the language of the heart. When he was a teenager, I'd worried about his coldness, his inability to connect deeply with his peers. "He's just logical, Eleanor," Lucas had said, waving away my maternal concern. He thinks before he feels. That's a strength, not a weakness. I hadn't realized then that Lucas was describing himself and teaching Vincent the necessary emotional tools for his own secret life. Lucas needed Vincent to be a gatekeeper, an accomplice, someone who would prioritize logic over my pain. I remembered the time Clara left. Vincent was 8. He cried for 3 days, refusing to eat. I was distraught. Lucas, however, was strangely calm. He was the one who went to see Clara in her new, small apartment near our home. He told me it was an act of kindness, a final courtesy to thank her for her years of service. "The child needs closure, Eleanor. She was his primary caregiver. It's mature to acknowledge that." He returned late that night, looking exhausted, but also settled. That night, for the first time in months, he had been relaxed. He had been present. I attributed it to the successful closure of a painful event. I see now he was establishing the foundation of his parallel life, and he wasn't giving Vincent closure. He was establishing the arrangement with his beloved. Clara's proximity was no coincidence. Her small apartment not far from our home. My own generosity, giving her money out of pity. Every element was part of Lucas's brilliant, cold design. He had kept his angel close, hidden in plain sight, ensuring his son knew where to find her, and that his wife, cloaked in her comfortable delusion, was paying for the security of his other woman. The depth of his manipulation was staggering. It wasn't just a moment of weakness. It was a structure of calculated emotional deceit, built brick by brick over decades. The message wasn't just, "I love her." It was, "I used your trust and your love to keep her safe." I walked out of Lucas's study, the cool air of the hallway washing over my face. I needed to move beyond recollection. I needed to act. The first step was to acknowledge that the life I had known was a lie. The second step was to start living the truth. I needed to understand what Vincent truly felt, whether he was merely following orders or if he genuinely believed in the necessity of his father's emotional cowardice. That was the core of the transmission I needed to stop. The following morning, I called Vincent. I used the landline, not my mobile, a small, deliberate act of formality that mirrored the cold, business-like tone I knew I needed to adopt. I had to speak to the lawyer, not the son. He answered on the first ring, his voice efficient and tired. "Mother, I've been trying to reach you. The arrangements are finalized. We'll be holding a quiet, private service at St. Michael's on Friday. The eulogy is prepared." "Who prepared it, Vincent?" I asked, keeping my voice level, stripped of all warmth. A pause, a small, telling hesitation. "I did, of course, with some input from the family." The family? Meaning Lucas's angel. "I'm sure it's a masterpiece of professional reverence, Vincent, but I want to discuss a specific clause, the financial arrangements regarding Clara Durant." The professional lawyer immediately took over. "Mother, there's no need to worry. Father made a separate, confidential trust. It's fully funded and legally sound. It secures her living expenses, medical care, and property. It was all handled discreetly years ago. There's no liability to the main estate." "I'm not worried about the liability, Vincent. I'm worried about the legacy." "I don't understand," he said, his voice tightening. "Of course you don't. You've been trained not to. Lucas didn't just leave a trust fund. He left an instruction for you to continue his deceit. He didn't just betray me. He made you his accomplice. He taught you that the most important thing in life is managing appearances, maintaining stability at the cost of honesty." The silence on the line was heavy, thick with resistance. "I was 8 years old, Mother, when Father first told me about Clara. He said she was his responsibility. He said that sometimes love and duty have to walk separate paths to protect the social structure. He made it sound like a complex moral theorem." I felt a surge of cold fury. Lucas hadn't just used his intellect to hide his affair. He had weaponized it, turning his selfishness into a lesson in mature complexity for his 8-year-old son. It was a lie, Vincent. A sophisticated, cruel lie designed to justify his own cowardice. He didn't protect the social structure, he protected himself from facing the consequences of his choices. He taught you that the price of stability is emotional paralysis. He loved you, Mother, in his own way, Vincent argued, the lawyer momentarily retreating, the defensive son emerging. He respected the structure. He provided everything. He provided a shell, Vincent, and he used you to keep the secret. He passed the debt of his affair on to you. Do you realize what you're doing? You are honoring the emotional infidelity that ruined my life. You're validating the behavior that leaves a woman alone, not because her husband died, but because his heart was never hers. I paused, letting the severity of my words sink in. I need you to look at this not as a legal matter, but as a moral one. The man you thought was an intellectual pillar was just a fraud. He taught you that the best way to deal with a broken commitment is to hide it and make someone else manage the mess. I am doing what Father asked, Vincent insisted, his voice hardening, the lawyer back in full force. It's about honor. No, Vincent, honor is honesty. This is about compliance. It's about continuing the generational wound. You saw what his silence did to me. Do you want to repeat that pattern? Do you want to spend your life managing a complex moral theorem instead of simply living truthfully? I knew I was pushing him too far, too fast, but the funeral was approaching, and the moment he gave the eulogy, the moment he formally validated Lucas's life, the lesson would be cemented. I changed tactics. I won't stop you from honoring his financial wishes to Clara, but I want to see her. I want to speak to her before the funeral, not about money, about the man. I need to understand the full dimensions of the ghost I married. He hesitated again. Why, Mother? Why open old wounds? Because, Vincent, you can't heal a wound until you see it clearly, and right now you are still blind. Bring her to the house, today. I need to know what a true, unreserved connection looked like to your father, so I can finally tell the difference between silence and depth. After a long silence, Vincent gave in. All right, Mother, I'll bring her this evening, 6 o'clock. I hung up. My hand was shaking. I had opened the vault of Lucas's life, and now I was inviting his angel into the monument of my failure. This confrontation wasn't about revenge. It was the required surgical act to stop the lie from passing down to my son. I had to face Clara, the true wife of the ghost, to finally kill the fantasy of my own stable life. The house felt different at 6 o'clock. It was the same space, the same heavy oak and hushed atmosphere, but now it held an electric tension, the kind that precedes a storm. I stood by the fireplace in the main drawing room, the room Lucas had always preferred for its formality. I wanted the setting to be as cold and structured as the lie we were about to dissect. The doorbell rang precisely at 6. Vincent was prompt, always. He entered first, followed by Clara. Clara Durant wore a dark, simple dress. She looked older than she had at the hospital, the fragility now settling into something more resigned, perhaps even weary. Her large, sad eyes, the ones I remembered from her nanny days, fixed on me with a mixture of apprehension and something harder to place. Not guilt, but a quiet, accepted ownership. Vincent stood slightly behind her, a protective wall, the son guarding his father's secret love. Mother, Vincent started, his voice the lawyer's voice. Clara is here as you requested. I would advise keeping the discussion brief and focused on the practicalities. Practicalities were Lucas's specialty, Vincent, I said, looking only at Clara. But tonight we discuss the impractical, the heart. Thank you for coming, Clara. Clara took a small, uncertain step forward. Eleanor, I'm so sorry about Lucas. Were you? I asked, the question delivered without heat, merely as an exploration of fact. Or are you simply sorry for yourself? Lucas is no longer physically here to manage your security. That is the truth of your sorrow, isn't it? Clara flinched, not from anger, but from accurate suddenness. Vincent made a sharp, warning sound. I silenced him with a glance. Vincent, this conversation is between the wife and the life, I said. Clara looked down, twisting her hands. I loved him, Eleanor, for 35 years. I never stopped. I know that, Clara. Lucas made sure of it, didn't he? He kept you close. He installed you in Vincent's heart. He used my blind faith and my money to secure your parallel existence. I stepped closer. I want to know what he gave you that he never gave me. I want the inventory of the ghost's love. Her eyes lifted, suddenly blazing with a desperate honesty. He gave me recognition, Eleanor. He saw me. He saw my soul. I saw him every day, I countered. I bore his son. I managed his life. I curated his reputation. You curated an image, Eleanor. That was your job. You were the stable framework. But the framework is cold. I was the warmth. When Lucas came to me, he wasn't the respected intellectual. He was just a man. He cried. He was scared. He had feelings. He would sit in my small kitchen and he would talk about his childhood, about his real ambitions, about the fear that his success was hollow. He talked to me about everything he kept silent from you. The word everything landed like a small, heavy stone. I realized my stability was not a structure of love, but a prison of silence. Lucas had used me as his shield from the real world, and he used Clara as his escape into it. Did you know he wrote poetry, Eleanor? Clara whispered. Small, terrible poems. But they were his. He wrote them for me. He read them to me. He used to say, Clara, only you see the mess beneath the success. You only saw the success. I felt a sudden, sharp intake of breath. Poetry. Lucas, the logical businessman, writing terrible, secret poetry. It was an act of emotional recklessness that he would never have risked with me. I would have analyzed it, critiqued it, framed it for the wall. Clara simply received it. And Vincent? I pressed, shifting the focus to the generational transmission. When did you bring my son into your secret? When did you start teaching him that this deceit was noble? Clara looked distraught. I never taught him deceit. Lucas told him the truth when he was still a boy, when he was 8. Vincent had asked why I left. Lucas explained that some relationships are too fragile for the world, too honest to be ruined by expectation. He told Vincent that he loved us both, you for the structure and me for the feeling. He taught Vincent that it was his duty to safeguard the feeling. Vincent finally spoke, his voice tight with defensive conviction. It wasn't deceit, Mother. It was a mature separation of spheres. Father gave you the security of the name and the status. He gave Clara the intimacy of his true self. He was merely allocating his emotional resources fairly. The lawyer's defense mechanism was perfect, allocating emotional resources. Lucas had turned his affair into a business model. Did it ever occur to you, Vincent, that Lucas wasn't allocating resources but simply stealing them? He stole the honesty that was due to me. He stole the integrity that was due to you by making you complicit. Clara stepped in front of Vincent, her gaze now fixed on me with unexpected pity. He was weak, Eleanor. He couldn't face breaking the structure you both built, but he paid for that weakness. He lived 2 lives, and he was never truly happy in either. He died holding my hand, yes, but he died terrified that you would realize how deeply he needed both of us to survive. And you were content with the scraps? I asked, a bitter taste in my mouth. They weren't scraps to me. They were the truest parts of him, the quiet hours, the fear, the poetry. You had the whole block of ice, Eleanor. I had the fire he kept hidden underneath. Clara's words were a brutal kind of mercy. They didn't excuse Lucas, but they defined him as tragically flawed, not purely malicious. He was a man who chose comfort and convention over truth, and then lived a parallel life to compensate for the emotional suffocation he himself created. I looked at Vincent. He was listening, absorbing the painful truth from both sides. He saw his father defined by 2 women, the one who loved his success and the one who loved his failure. You understand now, Vincent, I said softly, that this arrangement was never about protecting Clara. It was about protecting Lucas from his own choices, and he passed that burden, that moral debt, directly to you. I turned back to Clara. You can keep the trust, Clara. I won't fight the ghost's final instructions, but I want something else. I want the poetry. I want the terrible, honest poems he wrote. I want to see the man I never met. Clara hesitated, then nodded slowly. They are in a small wooden box by his bed at my place. I will bring them to you after the funeral. The meeting was over. The structure was officially broken. The price of stability was laid bare. The next day was the funeral. The atmosphere at St. Michael's was exactly as Lucas would have designed it. Tasteful, reserved, and packed with Chicago's most respectable citizens. Everyone spoke of Lucas Moreland's integrity, his unwavering stability, and his commitment to his wife and his community. The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. I sat in the front pew, dressed in dignified black, the picture of the grieving, resolute widow. But my grief had been transformed into a cold, clear-eyed dissection. I wasn't mourning my husband. I was mourning the years I wasted on a ghost. Vincent stood at the pulpit to deliver the eulogy. He was commanding, eloquent, and perfectly composed. He spoke of his father's logic, his discipline, and his legacy of success. He quoted a philosopher Lucas admired, discussing the virtue of structure and order. But something was different. Midway through the eulogy, when he was describing Lucas's commitment to providing a safe harbor for his family, Vincent faltered. His eyes, usually so sharp, drifted to mine. He paused, a full, painful second of silence that hung in the quiet church. He didn't break. The lawyer took over again, smoothly regaining control. But the slip was a victory for me. The truth I forced him to confront the night before had cracked his composure. The perfect facade was strained. After the official service, there was a small reception at a quiet gallery downtown. Clara did not attend. She was wise enough to know her place was not in this public structure. I watched Vincent interact with his father's colleagues. He was fielding condolences, taking on the role of the new family patriarch with practiced ease. But every time a colleague mentioned Lucas's great love for his wife, Vincent's smile was just a fraction too rigid. I cornered him by a quiet, abstract painting. "You hesitated, Vincent," I noted, sipping my water. He straightened his tie, avoiding my eyes. "The lighting was poor, nothing more." "You are a brilliant lawyer, Vincent. You don't make mistakes. You hesitated because for a split second, the beautiful, respectable lie you were telling clashed with the painful, honest truth you learned last night. You realized that your father's safe harbor was built on sand, and you were the one now charged with painting the facade." He sighed, the sound of profound exhaustion. "What do you want from me, Mother? Forgiveness? I can't give you that. I honor my father's wishes. He chose to manage his emotional life this way. I see the flaw, yes, but I also see the necessity of structure. It allowed him to function. It protected the family fortune. It kept you in luxury." "He bought my silence, Vincent, and he bought yours by giving you a noble-sounding duty to perform. But duty built on a lie is still slavery. You are free now, Vincent. You are your own man. You don't have to carry his moral debt." "And you think the answer is to tear down everything?" he challenged, his voice rising slightly. "No. The answer is to build something true. I don't want you to tear down the structure. I want you to stop lying about what it holds. Your father was a coward. He never faced the consequence of his choices. He taught you that integrity is negotiable. That is the wound I want to stop from replicating." I looked pointedly at the painting, a chaotic blend of sharp lines and muted colors. "Look at that painting, Vincent. It's an honest mess. Our life was a perfectly framed emptiness. Which one do you want to live in?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. He was paralyzed between the ingrained habit of logic and the sudden, searing truth of feeling. The next day, as promised, Clara came to the house alone. She didn't ring the bell. She simply stood on the porch, holding a small, polished wooden box. I met her in the foyer. No formality this time. She held out the box. "The poems," she said simply. "And a letter he wrote a few months ago. For me." I took the box. It was surprisingly heavy, filled not just with paper, but with the weight of an entire hidden life. "The letter, Clara," I said. "Read it to me. Now. I need to hear his last words to you, unmediated by my imagination." Clara hesitated, then slowly opened the folded, creamy parchment. Her voice was thin, but steady, laced with a familiar, intimate melancholy that told me she had read these words many times. "My dearest Clara," she began, reading aloud the final testament of the ghost. "The time is short now. I have lived a full life, they will say. But you and I know the truth. I lived the part I was given, and I held the part I desired. You are the desired part. Thank you for never demanding more than I could give, for understanding the chains of my duty. I wish I had been stronger. I wish I could have simply chosen you, openly, but I was not a man built for that kind of integrity. I am giving you security through Vincent because I trust his logic to protect my feelings. Forgive my weakness. Hold on to the poetry. It is the only true witness to the man you saved from the silence. Always yours, L." The words were devastatingly clear. He saw his weakness. He knew his moral failing. And he chose, even at the end, to prioritize his own fear of disruption over the emotional well-being of his wife. He even named his cowardice. I was not a man built for that kind of integrity. When Clara finished, she looked up, her eyes wet but firm. He chose comfort over truth, Eleanor, and the silence became his true punishment. I nodded slowly, holding the wooden box tightly. Thank you, Clara. You gave me the final piece of the inventory. I now have the full truth. You may go now, and you are finally free from the structure he used you to maintain. Clara gave a slight, sad smile. She didn't apologize, and she didn't need to. She walked out of the house and out of my life, taking with her the last tangible piece of my husband's secret. I carried the small wooden box to the quietest room in the house, the sunroom, which overlooked the meticulously kept rose garden. It was a space I rarely used, precisely because Lucas had found it too frivolous. I settled into a wicker chair, placing the box on a low glass table. This was where I would finally meet the real Lucas Moreland. The box was made of dark, unadorned mahogany. It felt heavy with secrets, dense with the emotional life he had starved our marriage of. I ran my fingers over the smooth surface, imagining Lucas, the intellectual pillar of Chicago, sitting in Clara's small, warm kitchen, hunched over this box, pouring out the fear and passion he deemed unfit for his respectable life. I lifted the lid. Inside, the box was lined with a soft, faded velvet, and it held not money or jewels, but stacks of creamy paper, some folded, some rolled, and all covered in Lucas's neat, surprisingly small handwriting. The poetry. I picked up the first sheet. It was titled simply, "The Window." I look at the glass. It reflects the room you built. Solid wood, cool marble, and the perfect, polished silence. I am the man in the glass, unbreakable, unfeeling, unquestioned, but the air I breathe is thin and cold. And across the city, there is a small, cracked pane of cheap glass where the steam from your kettle fogs the view. When I look through that window, I see only the shadow of the man I truly am, scared, hungry, human. And the world I built here shatters. I live in the reflection. I yearn for the steam. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't the terrible poetry Clara had described. It was the raw, unpolished confession of a profoundly unhappy man. He hadn't been silent with me out of depth. He had been silent out of fear. Fear that I would reject the scared, hungry, human man beneath the stable image. He had needed the silence to maintain the reflection. I reached for another, a poem dated shortly after Vincent's high school graduation. It was titled, "The Handoff." My son walks like me now, The same measured stride, the same careful posture. I have given him the keys to the castle of silence. I have taught him the protocols of the acceptable life. He will be safe inside these walls. But I have also taught him the necessity of the secret garden, the shame, the burden, the fear that the only way to survive the structure is to build a hidden door leading to the true heart. I gave him my moral wound, my most terrible inheritance. This poem was the dagger. It confirmed my darkest suspicion. Lucas knew exactly what he was doing to Vincent. He understood the toxic legacy he was passing down, the idea that compartmentalized deceit was the prerequisite for success. He wasn't a blind fool, he was a conscious architect of emotional damage. He saw his sin and decided to make his son his co-conspirator to alleviate his own guilt. I spent the next 2 hours reading through the archive of his soul. There were descriptions of their clandestine meetings, brief, stolen moments in quiet parks or her small apartment. There were poems of desperate longing and poems of profound, aching gratitude directed toward Clara for accepting the shadow man. There was one poem, a long narrative, describing a night, perhaps 20 years ago, when Lucas had almost left me. I stood at the door, the car engine running, the briefcase packed with the papers of my freedom. Clara waited, trembling by the lamppost. The air was electric with the possibility of truth. I looked back at the house, at the expensive silence, at the closed bedroom door. I thought of the bank accounts, the reputation, the headlines, and most of all, the look on Eleanor's face. Not anger, worse, the terrible, absolute lack of surprise. I saw myself destroying the reflection, and I was afraid of the wreckage I could not control. I turned the engine off. I walked back inside, into the comfort of the lie. I told Clara the silence was stronger than the love, and I became a ghost in 2 women's lives. He had seen my reaction before it happened, the terrible, absolute lack of surprise. That was the key to my own decades of compliance. I had become so comfortable in the role of the stable wife, so invested in the image of the perfect marriage, that his departure would have ruined my masterpiece, not just his life. He was a coward, yes, but I had provided the prison walls. My stability was just as rigid as his silence. I finally reached the last item in the box, a folded letter, clearly the one Clara had read to me the previous day. But beneath it was one final, crisp sheet of paper I hadn't noticed. It was a single typed paragraph tucked into the bottom corner. It was dated just 3 weeks before his death. It was addressed not to Clara, but to me, to Eleanor. I am not built for the integrity required to tell you this face to face. My final betrayal is that I am leaving you with the truth I should have given you 30 years ago. I hope you find the courage to use this wreckage not for bitterness, but for freedom. Do not let my cowardice infect Vincent. His stability is a trap. Teach him how to feel. It is the only thing I truly regret not giving him. L. I didn't cry. I was past tears. This final letter was not an apology. It was a confession and a directive. Lucas, the ghost, was giving me his last painful wish. Do not let my cowardice infect Vincent. He knew the nature of the generational wound he had inflicted. He knew that the only way to stop it was for me to break the structure I was equally invested in. I sat back in the wicker chair, the afternoon sun warming my face, and I realized that my task was not to condemn Lucas, but to understand his fear. He was trapped by his own expectations of success and public image, and in his final moments, his greatest act of love was not his tenderness towards Clara, but his desperate warning to me about Vincent. The fight was no longer over Lucas. The fight was over the soul of my son, a soul currently paralyzed by the illusion of allocated emotional resources. I stood up, the wooden box suddenly light in my hands. I placed it gently back on the table. I needed to move. I needed to act on this final, unexpected directive. I knew exactly where I had to go. Vincent was staying at his own apartment downtown, handling the complex legal aftermath. I drove there, not with the intention of arguing, but with the intent to perform the moral surgery Lucas had instructed. I found Vincent in his living room, working late, surrounded by legal briefs and coffee cups. He looked exactly like Lucas, serious, logical, and entirely isolated. "Mother," he said, surprised, "I thought you were resting." "I've had enough rest," I said, walking to his large glass window, looking out over the city lights, the same lights Lucas would have seen from his office, the lights that represented the cage they both built. "I read the poetry, Vincent, and I read the final note he wrote to me." Vincent paled. He knew then that the game of professional detachment was over. "He wrote you a note?" "He did. And it wasn't an apology. It was an instruction. He told me that his stability was a trap. He told me not to let his cowardice infect you. He told me to teach you how to feel, because that is the only thing he regretted not giving you." I turned to face him. "Your father used you, Vincent. He made you his shield, his confessor, and his executor of deceit. He turned his affair into a moral theorem, so he wouldn't have to face the simpler, ugly truth. He was a dishonest husband and a fearful man." Vincent stared at the floor, his usual lawyerly composure crumbling. "He said it was necessary, Mother, for the business, for the legacy. He said the world demands a price for stability. The price, Vincent, was your soul. Your father died knowing that. He was trapped in his own logic, and he was terrified that you would be too. He spent his life avoiding the wreckage of honesty, and now you are left with the wreckage of his lie." I took the envelope from my pocket. A simple, small envelope. It was not the final note. It was the deed to the main house in Lincoln Park. "The house, Vincent, is yours. The entire fortune, minus the trust for Clara, is yours. You are the sole beneficiary. You have the stability, the structure, the legacy." I slid the envelope across his desk. "Now, choose. Do you choose to live in the magnificent lie your father built, guarding his secrets and continuing his pattern of emotional paralysis? Or do you take this incredible stability and use it to finally live an honest, feeling, uncompartmentalized life?" "Mother, I don't understand," he whispered, his eyes wide, looking from the deed to my face. "It's simple, Vincent. The inheritance is yours, but I am moving out. I am taking nothing but my personal effects. I am selling my few valuable possessions. I am moving to a small seaside cottage in Cornwall I've been looking at, a place with rough air, salty silence, and a constantly changing view. A place where I can finally build a life that is small, painful, but true." I met his gaze. "I am choosing freedom, Vincent. I am choosing to stop being the woman who enabled your father's cowardice. Your stability is guaranteed. You have everything. Now, you must choose to have yourself. You must choose to break the chain. You must choose to feel the consequences of this truth and not just manage them." I walked toward the door. "The funeral is over, Vincent. The eulogy is delivered. The trust is funded. Your duty to the ghost is complete. Now start your life." The unfurnished life. I left the house in Lincoln Park exactly 3 weeks after Lucas's funeral. The process of dismantling 30 years of marriage had been surprisingly quick. When you know a life is built on a lie, the decision to tear it down becomes a cold, efficient necessity, not a messy, emotional battle. I sold everything that spoke of Lucas Moreland. The image, the heavy, expensive Persian rugs, the intimidating, dark furniture, the abstract art he had acquired only for its investment value. I kept only my personal effects, books I had read, a few pieces of jewelry he hadn't given me, and the small mahogany box containing his poetry. The box was no longer a symbol of betrayal, it was a map to the wreckage and a confirmation of my freedom. Vincent tried to stop me, of course, not with emotion but with logic. "Mother, this is fiscally irresponsible. he argued, standing in the marble foyer, surrounded by movers carefully boxing my old life. The house is a masterpiece. You are liquidating assets at a loss. I can provide for you. I can manage your portfolio. The house is a museum of a dead marriage, Vincent, I replied, taping shut a box of old correspondence. And I do not need a portfolio manager. I need a life manager, and that manager will be me. You are giving up stability, he insisted, his voice sounding hollow in the echoing space. Your father proved that stability is a magnificent lie, Vincent. I am choosing truth. Truth is rougher, less profitable, but it is real. You keep the structure. You keep the name. You keep the city lights. I am going to the silence where the air is honest. I saw the paralysis in his eyes. He had been given everything, the wealth, the stability, the directive to take care of his father's angel, but the sudden loss of the structure I provided had left him adrift. He was used to managing the lie. He didn't know how to navigate the truth. I didn't wait for his permission. I bought the seaside cottage in Cornwall, England, a place Lucas would have found offensively small and inconvenient. It was stone, wind-swept, and sat perched precariously on a cliff overlooking the brutal, beautiful Atlantic. The kind of place where the wind felt like a conscience and the sea smelled like salt and forgotten things. My journey across the ocean felt like a pilgrimage. Every mile put a physical distance between myself and the ghost. When I arrived, the cottage was bare, furnished only with the essentials I had shipped over: a plain bed, a small desk, a few lamps. It was an unfurnished life. The first month in Cornwall was the hardest. In Chicago, I had been Eleanor Moreland, wife of the respected Lucas Moreland. Here, I was just Eleanor. And Eleanor, I soon discovered, was profoundly, achingly lonely. The loneliness in Chicago was the loneliness of proximity, a ghost beside me in the bed, a son living within his own high walls of logic. It was a comfortable, curated loneliness. The loneliness in Cornwall was the loneliness of honesty. There was no one to impress, no role to play, no lie to maintain. I was alone with the silence, and in that silence I heard my own voice for the first time in decades. I would sit for hours by the window, watching the waves crash against the rocks. The sea was indifferent, powerful, and utterly transparent. It hid nothing. It was the antithesis of my Chicago life. I began to read Lucas's poetry again, but this time not with anger, but with an odd, cold sense of anthropological study. I was studying the habits of a species I had lived beside but never understood. I realized I had not truly loved Lucas. I had loved the role of Lucas's wife. I had loved the stability, the respect, the perfection of the image. Clara had loved the man, the flawed, fearful human who wrote terrible poetry. My realization was a double-edged sword. Lucas betrayed me, but I had also betrayed him by demanding the perfection that drove him to his secret life. My rigidity matched his cowardice. We were two sides of the same cold coin, and Vincent was the impression struck between them. The ghost's final warning echoed in my mind. Do not let my cowardice infect Vincent. Teach him how to feel. But how could I teach him to feel when I was just learning myself? I started with small acts of honesty. I wrote a letter to a woman I had inadvertently slighted at a charity event 20 years ago, a small, unnecessary act of contrition for a fault I had long dismissed. I started speaking to the local shopkeeper, not about the weather, but about the true, simple difficulties of village life. I allowed my small cottage to be messy, allowing a few dishes to sit in the sink, refusing to maintain the relentless, spotless perfection of my former life. These were small acts, but each one chipped away at the marble prison I had built for myself. Then, the emails from Vincent began. Initially, they were short, professional updates. Subject: Estate Management Update. Mother, I have finalized the sale of the assets. The proceeds have been deposited into the designated account. The market conditions were unfavorable, but I minimized the loss. No personal greeting, no inquiry about my well-being. Only logic. But then, the tone began to subtly shift. Subject: inquiry regarding former employee. Mother: I had an unexpected meeting with Clara Durant regarding a clerical error in the trust documentation. She mentioned that father always preferred the apartment on North State Street because it had a view of the park where he used to sit and read. I confirmed this detail via an old diary entry. Did you know he read in the park, not the library, during his lunch hours? He wasn't asking about business. He was asking about his father, the man. I replied simply, I only knew the man who worked in the library, Vincent. You must ask Clara about the man who read in the park. His next email was even more telling. Subject: unforeseen complication. Mother: I tried to relocate father's extensive collection of classical vinyl records from the study to my apartment. The majority of the collection is comprised of complex, emotionally dense symphonies. I find I have no emotional access to them. I feel a profound disconnect between the music he loved and the man I knew. Was this music part of the lie or part of the man? The lawyer was finally asking a question of the heart. The structure was cracking. I smiled, a small, genuine smile that felt strange on my face. He was asking to feel. My reply was brief. The music was part of the man, Vincent, but he never let the music touch the image. The music is not a code to be broken. It is a sound to be felt. If you cannot feel it, you cannot know the man who loved it. I realized then that my mission was not to tear down Vincent's life, but to give him the permission to break his own silence. Lucas had used Vincent's loyalty to perpetuate his deceit. I had to use my freedom to teach Vincent the cost of emotional silence. The true work of stopping the generational wound was beginning, not in a grand confrontation, but in the quiet, honest exchange of emails, thousands of miles apart. I had passed on the inheritance of truth, and now I had to wait for the seed of feeling to sprout in my son's cold, logical soil. I stood up and walked to the cliff's edge, letting the salty wind whip around me. The small mahogany box sat on my desk back in the cottage, a reminder of the ghost's instruction. Lucas, in his final, desperate act, had given me the tool to save his son from his own mistakes. My life in Chicago was over, but my life as a mother, a true mother, was just beginning. The weight of honesty. The Cornish winter settled in, a relentless onslaught of rain and wind that seemed to mirror the raw honesty of my new life. The small cottage, which had felt like a refuge, now felt like a stark, solitary anchor. My former life in Chicago, for all its emotional sterility, had been comfortable. It had a rhythm. It had people. Here, there was only the constant, deafening sound of the Atlantic and the quiet, demanding voice of my own solitude. I had traded the polished lie for the painful truth, and the truth, I discovered, was often cold and empty. I missed the routine of the respected wife. I missed the pretense of intellectual conversation. I missed the feeling of mattering in a large, significant way. I missed the mask. This was the core of my internal revelation. I had to admit that I was just as guilty as Lucas of loving the structure over the substance. My shock at his betrayal was partly narcissistic, the anger that my beautiful, perfect marriage had been ruined. I took to walking the cliffs, often stopping at the windiest points, letting the elements strip away the last remnants of my Chicago sophistication. I carried no phone, no timepiece. Time was measured only by the tide and the fading light. It was an exercise in radical self-acceptance. I was 65, alone, financially independent, but emotionally bankrupt, and utterly insignificant against the vastness of the sea. This honest insignificance was, paradoxically, my greatest source of strength. When you are truly alone and stripped bare, you stop caring about the reflection. The emails from Vincent became longer, less frequent, and astonishingly, more personal. He was struggling with the vinyl records. Subject: Rachmaninoff and failure. Mother: I cannot listen to the Second Symphony without feeling immense frustration. I put on the music, and all I hear is noise and drama. Father told me once that the only thing worth pursuing is logic, because feeling is chaos. But this music is chaos contained, and I cannot access the container. I tried to speak to my fiancée, Olivia, about it. She said simply, "It's beautiful and sad, Vincent. Just listen." I found her lack of analytical response deeply unsettling. He was experiencing emotional paralysis, the exact wound Lucas had intended to pass down. He was trying to apply a legal brief to a symphony. I wrote back, "Your father taught you to manage life, not to live it." Olivia is right. Stop analyzing the sound. Stop trying to find the formula for sadness. Just let the music break you, Vincent. Let the chaos in. The symphony is the truth of the emotional life your father denied, complex, overwhelming, and without a neat conclusion. I knew he needed more than my distant advice. He needed a direct confrontation with the feeling Lucas had compartmentalized. He needed to talk to Clara, not as his father's executor, but as his father's son. I included a final line in my next email. "Clara is the keeper of the chaos, Vincent. Go talk to the woman who loved the flaw, not the reflection." Vincent's response was a full week of silence. Then, a single email arrived. Subject: Clara. I saw her. That was it. No detail, no analysis, just 2 words, an acknowledgement of action driven by necessity, not duty. I waited. I knew the conversation they had was far more important than any legal brief or financial report he could send. Finally, he wrote a long, detailed email, a narrative unlike anything I had ever received from my son. "Mother, I drove to Clara's apartment. I didn't call first. I arrived at 7 p.m., the time she said father always visited after his urgent calls. She opened the door, and for the first time, I saw her not as Aunt Clara or the beneficiary, but simply as a woman who had loved my father. Her apartment was small, full of color and life, messy in a warm, comforting way. I didn't bring up the trust. I didn't bring up the will. I brought up the poetry. I took the most honest, raw lines I could find, the ones where father confessed his fear of the structure. I read them to her. Clara didn't cry. She smiled, a deeply sad, knowing smile. She told me father would always read his newest poem to her, sitting at her small kitchen table with a cheap glass of wine. She said he would read it, look up, and apologize for its quality, but she always told him, "Lucas, it's not about the words, it's about the truth." Then, she told me a story I never knew. The reason father chose to stay, the night he almost left. It wasn't just the fear of the headlines, Mother. It was the guilt of inflicting a wound on an innocent boy. He looked at me, asleep in my bed, and realized that leaving you would also mean destroying the stability he had engineered for me. He thought the quiet betrayal was the lesser evil to the violent destruction of a family. "Your father loved you, Vincent," Clara told me. "He just didn't know how to love without hiding. He gave you the structure because he was terrified you wouldn't be able to survive without it, just as he couldn't." I realized then that the moral theorem he taught me, the separation of love and duty, was his attempt to justify his cowardice to his 8-year-old son, using logic as a shield against guilt. The entire affair was not just about his love for Clara. It was about his fear of disappointing me, the logical, structured son he wanted me to be. When I left, Clara didn't ask me to take care of her. She asked me to take care of myself. She said, "Don't be afraid of the messiness, Vincent. Your father was, and it killed the best parts of him." I came home. I put on the Rachmaninoff, and for the first time, I didn't try to understand the notes. I just felt the huge, soaring sadness. It was overwhelming. It was beautiful. And I cried, Mother. I cried not for my father's death, but for his life, the life he was too afraid to live. The music is still noise and drama, but now I hear the truth in the chaos. V. I put the laptop down and walked out onto the cold, wind-swept porch. Tears finally came to my eyes, not tears of my own pain, but tears of relief for my son. Lucas's final, desperate directive had been fulfilled. The generational wound was not replicated. Vincent was breaking the chain. He had allowed himself to be broken by the music, by the honesty of a woman who loved the chaos, and by the revelation that his father's structure was built on a terrified heart. I had been prepared to spend the rest of my life fighting a cold, logical man, but I was instead witnessing the birth of a complex, feeling human. My work was almost done. The Unbroken Chain. It was Christmas morning, 6 months after I arrived in Cornwall. A light, wet snow was falling, muffling the sound of the waves. I was sitting at my small desk, sipping tea, when my laptop signaled an incoming video call. It was Vincent. I hesitated, then answered. The screen flickered, showing Vincent in his Chicago apartment. The room looked sparser, less arranged than before. He was wearing a heavy knit sweater, not a button-down shirt. He looked younger, perhaps even vulnerable. "Merry Christmas, Mother," he said, his voice softer than I had ever heard it. "Merry Christmas, Vincent. You look different." He gave a small, wry smile. "I'm trying to access the chaos. It's a messy process." "And how is the symphony?" "Still overwhelming, but I'm learning to breathe through it." "I sold the Lincoln Park house, Mother." The news was a profound shock, even though it shouldn't have been. He had sold the monument to the respectable lie. Why, Vincent? It was an investment. It was his legacy. It was a tomb, Mother. Every room smelled like his silence. I realized I couldn't build an honest life there. I bought a small place near the park. It's older, slightly run down, but it has a view of the trees, a view of the park where Father used to read his poetry. He was deliberately choosing honesty over structure, choosing the man who read poetry in the park over the businessman in the study. "What about the firm? The career?" I asked, holding my breath. "I've resigned as lead counsel. I'm starting a small, independent practice, taking on cases I actually care about. Less profit, more purpose." I realized that my father's logic was just a fear of consequence. I don't want to live that way. I want to live a life where my private feelings and my public actions are the same. He was giving me the precise, tangible evidence that Lucas's wound would not be replicated. He was choosing integrity. "And Clara?" I asked gently. "I see her occasionally, not as a duty. I see her as a friend. She's moving. She's bought a small cottage in the south, using the trust money. She's finally using the security Father gave her to build a life for herself, not just to wait for him." The ghost's parallel life was finally dissolving, leaving behind 2 free women and a son who was no longer enslaved by a secret. "You've done it, Vincent," I whispered, tears blurring my vision. "No, Mother. We did it. You showed me the cost of the lie. Father left me a legacy of deceit, but you left me the inheritance of truth. You gave me permission to be messy. You walked away from everything to break the chain. I realized that the greatest act of love is not providing stability, it's demanding honesty." He looked directly into the camera, his gaze clear, without the lawyer's guarded distance. "I learned that I cannot stop the betrayal of others, but I can stop the wound from repeating in my own life. I will not teach my children how to compartmentalize their hearts." His words, simple and direct, were the ultimate fulfillment of the Kitsch Band's central message. The generational wound was healed. "What will you do now, Mother?" he asked. "I will continue to live my small, unfurnished life," I said, looking out at the snow-dusted cliffside. "I am learning to love the woman who is only Eleanor. She is quiet. She is sometimes lonely, but she is honest, and that is a magnificent thing." We talked for a while longer, about the future, about his new life, and about the sheer, terrifying freedom they both now shared. Before he hung up, he told me he had finally found a use for Lucas's vast vinyl collection. "I donated it, Mother, to a local music conservatory. I told them to play it loud, to let the chaos out. I kept only one record, the Rachmaninoff. And why that one? Because that is the one that broke me, and I want to remember what it feels like to break. It's the only way to stay human. The call ended. I sat back, letting the quiet of the cottage settle over me. The ghost of Lucas Moreland, the man who demanded perfection and lived a lie, was finally laid to rest. He had not won. His fear had not infected his son. I stood up and walked to the window. The snow was lifting, and a sliver of weak sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the wild, untamed sea. I picked up the small mahogany box. It was no longer a map to betrayal, but a history book, marking the exact moment the old world ended and the new one began. The message was clear, etched not in stone or logic, but in the soft, fragile material of the human heart. We cannot stop others from betraying us, but we can stop that wound from repeating across the next generation. I had chosen the wreckage of truth over the comfort of the lie. I had chosen to feel rather than to manage. I had chosen the messy, complicated freedom of the unfurnished life, and finally, peacefully, Eleanor Moreland smiled. She did not smile for a spectator, or for a husband, or for a son. She smiled for herself. Tôi hiểu rằng bạn muốn tôi bổ sung thêm một đoạn dài khoảng 300 từ vào kịch bản đã hoàn thành, tổng cộng 1232 từ trước đó. Tuy nhiên, vì kịch bản đã kết thúc ở hồi 2, phần 3, với sự giải tỏa và thông điệp cuối cùng, The Unbroken Chain, việc thêm một đoạn dài 3.000 từ vào sau đó sẽ làm mất đi sự cô động và nhịp điệu kết thúc hoàn hảo của câu chuyện. Để đáp ứng yêu cầu của bạn về độ dài và vẫn giữ được cấu trúc cũng như ý nghĩa cốt lõi của kịch bản, tôi đề xuất một phương án sau. Phương án, tôi sẽ viết một fan bổ sung, Epilogue, The New Architecture. Phần này sẽ không làm thay đổi kết luận của hồi 2, mà sẽ đi sâu hơn vào việc Eleanor và Vincent thực sự sống cuộc đời mới của họ như thế nào sau 1 năm. Nó sẽ là một cảnh kết nối kéo dài và sâu sắc, mô tả cụ thể và đầy chi tiết về kiến trúc mới, The New Architecture, mà họ đang xây dựng. Sự bình yên mới của Eleanor, cuộc sống hàng ngày, đối diện với nỗi cô đơn và học cách viết lách, tìm thấy tiếng nói. Sự thay đổi của Vincent, cuộc sống ở căn hộ mới, công việc mới và cách anh ta thực hành cảm xúc trung thực trong mối quan hệ với Olivia. Cuộc gặp gỡ cuối cùng, một chuyến thăm của Vincent đến Cornwall để chứng kiến sự tự do của mẹ, củng cố thông điệp. Tôi sẽ đảm bảo phần này có độ dài gần 3.000 từ, sử dụng ngôn ngữ tiếng Anh và duy trì tiêu chuẩn TTS friendly. Fan Bo Sung, The New Architecture Epilogue. A year later. The New Architecture. A full year had passed since that quiet, snow-dusted Christmas morning when Vincent called. A year is enough time to let a structure settle, or to watch a ghost finally fade. For me, in the small stone cottage in Cornwall, the year was less about building and more about unbuilding. The silence here was still vast, but it had changed its quality. It was no longer the silence of denial, but the silence of acceptance. I had learned to occupy the empty space without rushing to fill it with noise or routine. I still walked the cliffs every morning, but now I took a small notebook. I had begun to write. Not poetry, I left that to Lucas, but simple, unadorned prose. I wrote about the colors of the sea, the texture of the stone, the taste of the strong black coffee in the morning. I wrote about the loneliness, giving it a name and a shape, refusing to fear it. I realized that writing was the opposite of Lucas's silence. It was an act of explicit honesty. The biggest breakthrough of the year was accepting my own complicity. I had spent so long defining myself as the victim of Lucas's betrayal that I hadn't seen myself as the keeper of the silence. I had thrived on the perfection of the image, the luxury, the stability. I had feared the messy collapse as much as Lucas did. My new life was not glamorous. My hands were often cold. The damp air seeped into the stone walls. My daily companion was an elderly border collie named Finn, a stray I adopted from a local farm. Finn demanded nothing but presence and a shared view of the horizon. He was the perfect antithesis to the demanding, complicated structure of my past. My emotional inheritance from Lucas, the mahogany box, remained on the desk. I rarely opened it, but I often ran my hand across its smooth, cool surface. It was a relic of a past life, a reminder that the greatest tragedy is not betrayal, but the failure to live authentically. Vincent came to visit in the late spring. He had called 2 weeks ahead, meticulously scheduling his visit, a Thursday to Saturday excursion, booking a room at the small, sturdy inn down the road. The old Vincent would have calculated the most efficient flight path and hotel rating. When he arrived, he looked relaxed. Not casual. Vincent would never be casual, but the rigidity had softened. He wore comfortable jeans and a thick wool jumper. He carried a small, worn leather bag, not a briefcase. We stood on the cliff path outside the cottage, the wind whipping his hair around his face. "The air smells different," he observed, breathing deeply. "It smells honest, Vincent. It smells like salt and truth." "It's beautiful, Mother, but it is profoundly unsettling. That is the price of honesty. It never settles. It only shifts." We spent the afternoon talking, not about the past, but about his present. He was working his new law practice out of a small office, specializing in environmental cases. Less money, more impact. "I'm learning to manage chaos, not just structure," he explained, sitting by my small fireplace. "I had a case last month where a colleague introduced a flawed piece of evidence. The old me would have seized the tactical advantage, logically dismantling the opposition. The new me..." I pointed out the error to the colleague privately. "We fixed the mistake. We won the case honestly." I smiled. "And what was the consequence of choosing integrity?" "A difficult conversation, a loss of tactical advantage, but a feeling of cleanliness." I realized that the structure Father built was merely a mechanism to justify cutting ethical corners. If you are always logical, you are never wrong. If you are always honest, you accept the mess. He talked about Olivia, his fiancée. The lawyer who had only allocated resources was now learning how to love. "I've started telling her my fears, Mother," he confessed, looking into the fire. Not in a structured analysis of my anxiety, but just saying, "I am afraid of failing this case," or "I am worried about our future." I was afraid that sharing my vulnerability would make her respect me less. Instead, it made her love me more. He looked up, a raw, genuine look I rarely saw in him. "Father taught me that intimacy was a vulnerability to be avoided. You taught me it is the only true strength." Later that evening, after Finn had curled up by the hearth, Vincent brought up Clara. "I saw her last month, before she moved to the coast, and she was packing her small home. I didn't help with the boxes. I just sat and talked. She told me the fear never left Father. She said even in their most intimate moments, he was always listening for the sound of the structure collapsing. He never truly enjoyed his secret life because he was always managing his public one." "He was a prisoner of his own success, Vincent," I confirmed, "and we were his well-paid guards." "I gave her the last of Father's papers, the ones not related to the trust, just some old photographs. She looked at them, and she didn't look sad. She looked free. She said, 'The ghost is finally gone, Vincent. Now we can mourn the man.'" Vincent paused, his hand tracing the rough wood of the mantelpiece. "I feel free too, Mother, but freedom is exhausting. I miss the simple stability of knowing my role." "That is the hardest part, Vincent. You must learn to love the empty space. You must learn to build your own architecture, one honest brick at a time." The next morning, before he left, Vincent did something unexpected. He walked to my desk, picked up the mahogany box, and looked at it. "Do you still need this, Mother? The map to the wreckage?" "No," I said, shaking my head. "I know the map by heart. The box is just a marker now." He nodded. He took the box, walked to the fireplace, and opened it. He pulled out all the papers, the poetry, the notes, the final instruction to me. He held them for a moment, then tossed them into the fading embers. The papers didn't instantly ignite. They curled, smoldered, and then caught fire with a quiet, persistent hiss. The flames were small and clean. "The ghost needed to be cremated twice," Vincent said quietly, watching the words turn to ash. He kept the box itself. "I want to keep the mahogany," he explained. "It's solid, but I will fill it with something else, perhaps sand from the park, or maybe just air." As I walked him to his rental car, the wind was fierce, pulling at our clothes. "I have to ask one last question, Mother. The note Father wrote you, the one where he confessed his cowardice. Why didn't you keep it? Why didn't you use it against him or against me?" I looked at him, my eyes clear. "Because the point wasn't to prove his guilt, Vincent. The point was to prove your freedom. The moment you chose honesty over compliance, the note became irrelevant. It was only ever a tool to break the silence." He nodded, a deep, understood nod. He hugged me then, a real hug, not the formal, brief embrace of the lawyer. It was awkward, but it was honest. "I'll call you, Mother, when I figure out what to put in the box." I watched his car disappear down the narrow, winding road. Then I walked back inside. The cottage smelled faintly of wood smoke and salt. I picked up my notebook and opened it to a clean page. I wrote the date and then paused. The new architecture was simple, built on the rough stone of acceptance, roofed by integrity, and warmed by a small but persistent, honest fire. I had survived the betrayal of a ghost and had stopped a generational wound. I was finally living a life that was not only stable, but true.